I'm not a man prone to late-night drives, but that night, something in the air felt different, like the world had tilted just a degree or two off its axis. I'd been at the bar, not drinking much, just enough to take the edge off a day that seemed to stretch longer than usual. You know how it goes, one of those days where the sun hangs in the sky too long, casting long, unnatural shadows that make you feel like something's watching you. But I digress. The night was thick with mist as I drove home, the kind that clings to your windshield, making you feel like you're driving through some ghostly dream. It was around midnight when I first heard the scream. A woman's voice, shrill, desperate, cutting through the quiet of the woods that flanked the road. It wasn't the kind of scream you hear in movies, all staged and dramatic. No, this was real. It was raw. It was the kind of scream that gets under your skin, sinks into your bones, and stays there. I should have kept driving. Any sensible person would have kept driving. But there was something in that scream, something that pulled at the frayed edges of my conscience. I've never been the hero type, not really, but I couldn't just ignore it. So I pulled over, killing the engine, and the silence that followed was almost as loud as the scream had been. The woods loomed on either side, dark and forbidding. Trees twisted together like gnarled hands, branches creaking in the faint breeze. The scream came again, closer this time, and I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. I grabbed my flashlight from the glove compartment, the beam slicing through the darkness like a knife. "Hello," I called, my voice swallowed by the trees. No answer, just the rustle of leaves, the distant call of an owl. "Hello? Are you hurt? I'm here to help." Again, that scream, but this time it was different. It was as if the woods themselves had taken the sound and twisted it, distorted it into something wrong. It echoed around me, bouncing off the trees, making it impossible to tell where it was coming from. I stepped off the road, my feet crunching on the underbrush. The flashlight beam wavered as I moved deeper into the woods, casting strange, shifting shadows that played tricks on my eyes. Every few steps I'd pause, listening, trying to orient myself. But the scream, always that scream, kept moving, leading me further and further into the darkness. The air grew colder the deeper I went, a biting chill that gnawed at my skin. My breath fogged in front of me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The trees seemed to close in around me, their twisted limbs reaching out like skeletal fingers. I should have turned back. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, but I couldn't. I was too deep in by then, physically, yes, but also mentally. I was hooked, caught by some invisible line that pulled me forward. The scream came again, but this time it was behind me. I spun around, the flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, but there was nothing. Just trees and shadows. The scream came again, closer now, too close. My heart hammered in my chest, each beat a drum of panic. I turned and ran, my feet slipping on the damp leaves, branches whipping at my face. I didn't know where I was running, only that I had to get out. But the thing about the woods is that they don't let go so easily. The trees seemed to shift around me, confusing my sense of direction. No matter how far I ran, the scream followed, always just out of reach, always behind me. My breath came in ragged gasps, my lungs burning, but I didn't stop. Couldn't stop. The scream was in my head now, echoing, reverberating, driving me to the brink of madness. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the screaming stopped. The silence was deafening, a heavy, oppressive thing that pressed down on me. I slowed to a stop, every nerve in my body on edge, listening, waiting. But there was nothing. No scream, no rustle of leaves, not even the distant call of that damned owl. Just silence. I stumbled out of the woods, onto the road, my legs trembling, my heart still pounding in my chest. I glanced back, half expecting to see something, but there was nothing there. Just darkness, thick and impenetrable. I stood there for a long moment, trying to collect myself, to make sense of what had just happened. But my mind was a jumbled mess, thoughts colliding with each other, refusing to settle. I drove home in a daze, the night closing in around me like a shroud. I barely slept, the scream echoing in my head, a haunting refrain that refused to be silenced. The next morning, the news was full of it. A woman's body had been found in the woods, not far from where I'd stopped. The details were scarce, but the implication was clear. She'd been dead for hours, maybe even before I heard the first scream. I try not to think about it too much, about what might have happened if I'd kept going, if I'd ventured deeper into those woods. But the truth is, it's always there, lurking in the back of my mind. The scream, the way it twisted and echoed through the trees, the feeling of being watched. Some nights, when the wind howls outside and the shadows stretch long and thin, I hear it again, that scream. And I wonder if maybe I didn't escape the woods after all. When you live in Maine, you get used to the snow. It comes down thick and fast, blanketing everything in a kind of quiet that's almost soothing. But this time, the snow was different. It wasn't the kind of snow you welcome, the kind that turns the world into a pristine winter wonderland. No, this was the kind of snow that comes down with a purpose, a malevolent intent almost, as if it knows something you don't. I should have known better than to drive in it, but then again, hindsight's always 20/20, isn't it? My truck was an old Ford, the kind that had seen better days but still ran well enough to get me from point A to point B. The heater worked, the engine hummed like a contented cat, and the tires, well, the tires were another story. They were balder than a cue ball, and I'd been putting off getting them replaced, thinking I could squeeze a few more miles out of them. Big mistake, huge. It was late, later than it should have been for me to be out on a road like that. The wind howled, whipping the snow across the windshield like a living thing, and the headlights barely cut through the thick curtain of white. The road was deserted, no cars, no streetlights, nothing but the endless stretch of darkness ahead of me and the oppressive white all around. Then, as if to mock my ill-preparedness, the truck gave a sputter, a cough, and then died right there on the road. Just like that. The engine quit, the lights went out, and the heater stopped blowing. The silence that followed was thick, almost suffocating, and for a moment, all I could hear was the rapid thudding of my own heart. I tried to restart the truck, but the engine just groaned and refused to turn over. Panic started to creep in. There was no one out here, no place to walk to, not in this weather. The temperature was dropping fast, and without the heater, I knew I'd be in serious trouble soon. Just when I thought things couldn't get any worse, I saw headlights in the rearview mirror. A set of high beams cut through the snow, getting closer and closer and closer until they were right behind me. Relief washed over me. Someone had seen my truck and stopped to help. I watched as a figure emerged from the car, a man, tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in a black coat and a hat pulled low over his eyes. He walked up to my window, and I rolled it down just a crack. The cold air bit at my face, sharp and unforgiving. "Need some help?" the man asked, his voice low and gravelly. "Yeah," I replied, trying to keep the desperation out of my voice. "My truck died, and I can't get it to start. You wouldn't happen to have a phone, would you?" "Mine's dead." "Sure," he said, reaching into his coat and pulling out a cell phone. "Here you go. Call for a tow." I took the phone with shaking hands and quickly dialed the number for roadside assistance. They told me it would be at least an hour before someone could get out to me. I handed the phone back to the stranger and thanked him. "No problem," he said, turning to go back to his car. "Just stay warm in there. Help's on the way." I nodded, rolling the window back up and wrapping my arms around myself, trying to ward off the cold. The man got back into his car, and I watched as his headlights disappeared into the swirling snow. For a moment, I felt a flicker of hope. But then, as the minutes ticked by and the cold seeped deeper into my bones, that hope began to wither. The road was still empty, the snow still falling thick and fast. I started to wonder if I'd imagined the whole thing, the man, the phone call, everything. That's when I heard it, a loud banging on my window. My heart jumped into my throat as I whipped around to see a man standing there, his face half hidden by the shadows, but the coat black and heavy was unmistakable. I rolled the window down just a fraction, the icy air rushing in. "Can you help me?" he asked, his voice now urgent, almost pleading. "I'm stranded out here. Please, let me in." Something was off, though. The voice wasn't quite right, and the way he stood there, leaning in close to the glass, made my skin crawl. I squinted, trying to see his face better, but the snow and darkness made it nearly impossible. It hit me then, the realization that sent a jolt of terror through me. The man outside my window, the one asking for help, looked just like the guy who'd handed me the phone not 10 minutes earlier. Same coat, same build, but something was wrong terribly, horribly wrong. "How did you get here so fast?" I stammered, my voice barely above a whisper. "You just drove off." He didn't answer, just kept banging on the window, harder this time. The glass rattled in its frame, and I could see the desperation in his eyes, or was it something else? Malice, maybe? A hunger that made my blood run cold. "Let me in," he shouted, his voice a harsh bark now. "It's freezing out here." I knew I couldn't open that door. I knew it with every fiber of my being. The man was lying, trying to trick me into letting him inside. But why? What did he want? The questions tumbled through my mind, but I didn't have time to find the answers. I fumbled with the lock, making sure it was secure, and pressed my back against the seat, as far away from the window as I could get. The banging grew louder, more frantic, and I could see the man's breath fogging up the glass, his hands pounding against the window with an unnatural force. And then, as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The man stepped back, his eyes boring into mine through the frosted glass. For a long, terrifying moment, we just stared at each other. Then he smiled a slow, cruel smile that sent a shiver down my spine and turned away, disappearing into the snow. I sat there, paralyzed, my breath coming in shallow gasps. I didn't move, didn't dare to, until the lights of the tow truck finally appeared in the distance, cutting through the storm like a beacon of hope. But even as the driver hooked up my truck and gave me a lift back to town, I couldn't shake the feeling that the man in the black coat was still out there, watching, waiting. And I knew, deep down, that if I'd opened that door, I wouldn't be here to tell this story. I still think about that night sometimes, especially when the snow starts to fall. I wonder who or what was really out there, and what might have happened if I'd given in to the fear. But I'll never know, and maybe that's for the best. Some things are better left in the dark, where they belong. It started as a night like any other, a date night. We were just two kids looking for a little adventure, nothing more. The kind of harmless fun that makes you feel alive when the rest of the world seems to be sleepwalking. Her name was Lily, and she was beautiful in that girl next door kind of way, soft blonde hair, wide blue eyes that sparkled with curiosity, and a smile that could make you forget your own name. We'd been seeing each other for a few weeks, long enough to know that something real was blossoming between us. That night, we'd gone out to one of those drive-in burger joints, the kind that seems to have been frozen in time since the 1950s. After polishing off a couple of greasy cheeseburgers and sharing a milkshake, we decided to go for a drive. There's something about night drives that feels like a secret just you, the road, and whatever shadows lurk beyond the reach of your headlights. The woods out by Route 47 were perfect for that kind of drive. Dense, dark, and silent as a grave. The kind of place that swallows sound and makes you wonder if the world outside the car still exists. I wasn't trying to scare her, not really. But I'll admit, there's a thrill in feeling that flicker of fear, like the warmth of a campfire on a cold night. Lily was game, too laughing, leaning over to change the radio station to something eerie, something to match the mood. We talked about urban legends, about the things that go bump in the night, but it was all in good fun. Until it wasn't. The road narrowed as we went deeper into the woods, the asphalt turning to gravel, and the trees closing in like a pair of jaws. Eventually, I pulled over. Nature was calling, and no matter how tough you think you are, you can't argue with biology. Lily teased me about it, but she had to go too, so we both got out. The air was colder than I expected, biting and still. I remember the sound of the car door slamming shut, too loud, too final. We didn't go far, just enough to find some privacy behind the trees. It was there, crouched behind an oak, that I first heard it a rustling, not more than 20 feet away. It was the kind of noise that could have been anything, but in the middle of those woods, it felt wrong. Like something was there with us, something that shouldn't be. I stood up, zipped my pants, and glanced over at Lily. She had heard it too. I could tell by the way she froze, her eyes wide, her breath caught in her throat. We didn't say anything, just listened, and that's when we saw him. He was standing in the clearing, a man, or at least something that looked like a man. He was tall, unnaturally so, with limbs that seemed too long for his body. His face was obscured by shadow, but I could see his eyes glowing faintly, like dying embers in a fireplace. He wasn't alone either. Draped over his shoulder was a blue tarp, the kind you use to cover a pile of wood or maybe something else, something that you don't want anyone to see. For a second, I thought he was just some homeless guy, maybe camping out in the woods. But then he moved, slow, deliberate, like a predator sizing up its prey. And there was something about the way he did it, something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. It wasn't just that he was there, it was like he was waiting for us, like he knew we'd come. Lily grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my skin. "Let's go," she whispered, her voice trembling. But I couldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, staring at the man with the blue tarp. There was something under it, something that shifted and bulged as he adjusted his grip. I couldn't see what it was, but I could feel it, something dark, something wet. And then he smiled. It was the smile that did it. That twisted, unnatural grin that split his face from ear to ear. It was like staring into the mouth of a shark, all teeth and hunger. That's when I snapped out of it, my fight or flight kicking in with a vengeance. "Get in the car," I muttered, but my voice was louder than I intended, panicked. "Now." We ran, no, we bolted. I could hear Lily's breath coming in ragged gasps beside me, her footsteps pounding against the earth. But behind us, there was nothing, no sound, no movement, just the heavy silence of the woods. And that was worse, far worse. I fumbled with the keys, hands shaking as I unlocked the car, and we dove inside. The engine roared to life, and I slammed on the gas, the tires kicking up gravel as we tore out of there. In the rearview mirror, I caught one last glimpse of him, standing in the middle of the road, that tarp still slung over his shoulder, that grin still plastered on his face. We didn't speak for the rest of the drive. There was nothing to say. When we finally reached the main road, the safety of civilization, I pulled over. We sat there, just breathing, just trying to make sense of what had happened. But the thing is, you can't make sense of something like that. You just can't. I still see him in my dreams sometimes, that man with the blue tarp. I wake up in a cold sweat, Lily beside me, sleeping peacefully, oblivious. I never told her, but I know she dreams about him too. I can tell by the way she clutches at the sheets, the way her breathing quickens in the dead of night. We don't talk about it though. We pretend it never happened. But some nights when the world is quiet and dark, I can almost hear that rustling again, like dry leaves on the wind. And I know, deep down, that he's still out there, waiting. The night was like a thick, inky blanket, wrapping the world in an unnatural silence. The road stretched ahead of us, a dark ribbon of asphalt that seemed to disappear into nothing. The only light came from the car's headlights, cutting through the night like knives, but beyond that, there was only darkness. The party had been loud, chaotic, full of laughter and bad decisions. The kind of night that left you feeling hollow, even as it buzzed with a fake sense of life. We were driving home now, trying to shake off the remnants of that artificial joy, when Daniela's voice cut through the silence. "I really need to go," she said, her voice tight with urgency. "Can we stop?" We all knew that tone. It was the kind of tone that meant there was no arguing, no waiting. So we pulled over. The crops were tall, towering over us like silent sentinels. They whispered in the wind, a soft, eerie sound that sent a shiver down my spine. Daniela hopped out of the car, muttering something about not being long, and then she was gone, swallowed up by the darkness. Minutes ticked by, each one feeling longer than the last. At first, we joked about it, how she must have found a better party out there in the corn. But then the laughter died, replaced by a creeping sense of unease. "She's taking too long," I said, voicing the worry that had been gnawing at me. "Someone should go check on her." Sarah and I exchanged a glance. No one wanted to say it, but we were all thinking the same thing. Something wasn't right. We climbed out of the car, leaving the others behind, their faces pale and anxious in the glow of the dashboard light. The crops rustled as we pushed through, the sound growing louder with every step, as if the plants themselves were whispering warnings. Daniela Sarah called out, her voice trembling slightly. "Where are you?" No answer. Just the endless rustling of the crops. We kept walking, the darkness pressing in on us from all sides. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of earth and something else, something metallic and sharp. And then we saw him. He was just standing there, a shadow among shadows, but there was something off about him. His clothes were tattered, hanging from his thin frame, like they were borrowed from a corpse. His eyes, God, I'll never forget those eyes. They were too bright, too intense, like headlights cutting through the dark. He was watching us, waiting. "Who are you?" Sarah demanded, her voice stronger than I felt. "Have you seen our friend?" He didn't answer, just stared at us with those piercing eyes. And then, with a slow, deliberate movement, he stepped aside. I didn't want to look, but something made me. Maybe it was instinct, maybe it was some twisted need to know. Daniela was lying on the ground, half hidden by the crops. Her face was pale, her eyes closed. There was blood on her forehead, a dark, sticky mess that glistened in the dim light. My stomach turned, a wave of nausea crashing over me. Daniela Sarah dropped to her knees beside her, frantically checking for a pulse. I could hear the panic in her breathing, feel the fear seeping into my bones. But all I could do was stare at the man, at the way he stood there, so calm, so still. It was like he was waiting for something, waiting for us to understand. He'd done this. I knew it in my gut, in the way you just know things sometimes, without any evidence or logic. He had hurt her, attacked her, and now he was standing there, like it was the most natural thing in the world. I wanted to scream, to demand answers, but the words were trapped in my throat, swallowed by the fear that had rooted me to the spot. Sarah was shaking Daniela now, pleading with her to wake up, but Daniela didn't move. She was breathing, thank God, but it was shallow, uneven, like she was fighting to hold on to consciousness. "Help me get her up." Sarah's voice was shaky, but determined. She wasn't ready to give up, not yet. But even as we lifted Daniela, even as we started dragging her back toward the car, I couldn't stop thinking about that man. He hadn't moved, hadn't said a word. He just stood there, watching us, his eyes burning with some cold, inhuman light. We stumbled back to the car, Daniela's weight heavy between us. The others rushed out to help, their faces a mix of fear and confusion. What happened? Is she okay? They bombarded us with questions, but we didn't have answers. We just wanted to get out of there, to put as much distance between us and that man as possible. We piled into the car, Daniela slumped in the back seat, her head resting on Sarah's shoulder. No one said anything as we sped off, the tires kicking up dust as we left that dark road behind. But I couldn't shake the feeling that we hadn't really left, that somehow a part of us was still out there, trapped in those crops, with that man and his terrifying silence. And in the pit of my stomach, I knew it wasn't over. Not by a long shot. I've always thought that nighttime belonged to those with secrets. The inky blackness wraps around you like a cloak, concealing your thoughts, your fears, and sometimes your sins. And in that darkness, you could almost convince yourself that the world was simpler, that you weren't just one wrong turn away from disaster. Almost. It was past midnight, and I was on that lonely stretch of highway, the one that seemed to stretch endlessly into nothingness. The road was empty, save for my headlights slicing through the thick, velvety dark. There was something comforting about the monotony of it all, just me, the hum of the engine, and the road. It was like the world had shrunk to just that narrow ribbon of asphalt, the rest of it slipping away into the void. I was tired, more than tired, really. Bone weary, the kind that makes your eyelids heavy and your thoughts slow. But home wasn't far now, just another 30 miles or so, and I'd be in my bed, away from the shadows that seemed to creep just out of sight, teasing the corners of my vision. And then I saw the flashing lights up ahead, red and blue, cutting through the night like knives. They blinked in and out, casting strange, jagged shadows across the road. My first thought was that it was some sort of accident, maybe a deer, maybe someone had swerved to miss it and lost control. But as I got closer, I realized it was a checkpoint. I should have been relieved, but instead, a sliver of unease wormed its way into my gut. A sobriety checkpoint out here? In the middle of nowhere? It didn't make sense. I was miles from the nearest town, and the road was as empty as a graveyard. Still, I slowed down, letting the car coast toward the figure standing by the side of the road. He was tall, dressed in the dark uniform of a state trooper, a wide-brimmed hat casting his face into shadow. His hand was raised, motioning for me to stop. I hesitated, just for a second, but then common sense kicked in. Better to cooperate, I told myself. Better to get this over with and get home. I pulled over to the side of the road, the gravel crunching under my tires. The man stepped closer, and as he did, I caught a glimpse of his face. Pale, almost waxy, like a mannequin's. His eyes were hidden beneath the brim of his hat, just two dark hollows that seemed to drink in the light. He tapped on my window with one gloved hand, the sound sharp and insistent. I rolled it down, the cool night air rushing in, carrying with it the scent of pine and something else, something metallic and faintly sour. "Evening, officer," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Is there a problem?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he just stared at me, his lips curled into a tight, humorless smile. "Routine checkpoint," he said finally, his voice low and smooth, like oil sliding over glass. "Just making sure everyone's driving safe tonight." There was something off about him, something that made my skin prickle. I couldn't put my finger on it, but it was there, lurking just beneath the surface. Still, I forced a smile, trying to ignore the growing sense of unease. "Of course, officer. Anything you need." He nodded, slowly, like he was considering something, then gestured toward my license and registration. I handed them over, the paper trembling slightly in my hand. He took them, his fingers brushing against mine, cold as ice. As he examined the documents, I took a moment to really look at him. His uniform was wrong, somehow. It was the right color, the right cut, but it didn't fit him, not quite. It hung on him, loose and ill-fitting, like it wasn't his, like it belonged to someone else. "Been out drinking tonight?" he asked, his eyes still on my license. He didn't move for a long moment, just stood there, staring at me with those dead eyes. Then, without warning, he reached into his coat and pulled out a gun, a sleek, black thing that gleamed in the moonlight. He pointed it directly at my face, his hand steady as a rock. "Get out of the car," he said, his voice cold and emotionless. I froze, my mind racing. This wasn't real, it couldn't be. But the gun was real, the threat in his voice was real, and if I didn't do something, anything, I knew this night would end in blood. But fear has a funny way of focusing the mind. In that moment, everything became crystal clear. The engine was still running, the gear shift within reach. All I had to do was move, just a little, just enough. I nodded, slowly, trying to keep him calm, trying to buy myself a few more seconds. "Okay," I said, my hand creeping toward the gear shift. "I'll get out." He didn't see it coming. I slammed the car into drive and floored it, the tires screeching against the asphalt as I tore away from him. For a second, I thought he might shoot, but there was nothing, just the roar of the engine and the pounding of my heart. I glanced in the rearview mirror, expecting to see him chasing after me, but the road was empty. The flashing lights had vanished, and the darkness had swallowed him whole. I didn't stop driving until I reached the lights of the nearest town, my hands still shaking as I pulled into the parking lot of an all-night diner. I sat there for a long time, the engine idling, trying to make sense of what had just happened. But there was no sense to be made, just the cold, hard truth that I had narrowly escaped something terrible. The next morning, I called the state police, told them what had happened. They checked the area, but there was no sign of a checkpoint, no sign of the man. It was like he had never existed at all. But I knew better. I knew what I had seen, what I had felt. The darkness hides many things, secrets and sins, yes, but sometimes it hides something worse. And that night, I had looked into the eyes of something that shouldn't exist, something that had slipped through the cracks in the world. And it had found me. I don't drive that road anymore. I take the long way home, through the well-lit streets of the city, where the darkness can't reach me. But sometimes late at night, when I'm alone in my bed, I see those flashing lights again, hear that cold, dead voice. And I wonder if, one day, I'll see him again. The night had draped itself over Vermont like an inky shroud, and the road stretched ahead in a black ribbon, endless and uninviting. I'd been driving for hours, my car's engine humming along in a comforting purr until, with a sputter and a groan, it conked out. The needle on the gas gauge had sunk to empty, and I was left stranded on this lonely stretch of asphalt. If you've ever been stuck in the middle of nowhere, you know that the silence is thick, almost suffocating. I tried the engine again, just to hear that god-awful click, 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 click of an engine that refused to start. It's a sound that digs deep into your gut, something primal that warns you you're alone, really alone. The woods around me were dense, ancient, and full of secrets that rustled in the darkness. It was the kind of forest that could swallow a person whole and never belch them up. I leaned against the hood of the car, trying to keep my anxiety in check, but the quiet of the night was unnerving. My flashlight flickered weakly, casting eerie shadows that danced across the trees. It was then that I heard an unmistakable rustling from the underbrush, like something or someone was moving stealthily through the woods. I squinted into the darkness, the beams of my flashlight cutting narrow paths through the blackness. My breath caught when I saw a figure, hunched and motionless, peering out from behind a tree. The way it moved or didn't move was wrong. It was too still, almost like it was waiting. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. I called out, my voice cracking like a dry twig. "Hello? Is someone there?" No response. Just the same unnerving silence. My flashlight beam wavered, and I fought the urge to turn it off. I fumbled with my phone, trying to dial for roadside assistance, but the signal was as dead as my car. The figure stayed put, unmoving, as if it was locked in place by something unseen. It was the kind of stillness that makes you want to scream, but the scream gets stuck in your throat. I tried to focus, straining my eyes to make out any details. It looked like a scarecrow, but I knew scarecrows didn't twitch like that. I glanced at the car's clock, nearly midnight. Just as I was about to turn back to the car, I felt a cold breath on the back of my neck. I spun around, but no one was there. Just the relentless darkness and the whispering wind. Panic surged through me, hot and sudden. My heart pounded like a drum, and I took a step back toward the car. That's when it happened. A hand, cold and clammy, grabbed my shoulder from behind. My blood turned to ice, and I spun around with a strangled cry. There, looming in the darkness, was a figure, its face obscured by the shadows. My flashlight flickered weakly, barely illuminating the thing that was holding me. I struggled, my fingers grasping at the cold, unyielding grip, but it wouldn't let go. Just then, the roar of an engine cut through the night. A beam of headlights swept across the forest, and the figure holding me recoiled, disappearing into the trees like a phantom. I whirled around to see a truck pulling up beside me, its bright lights illuminating the desolate road and casting long shadows that danced across the pavement. The driver, a grizzled man with a face like a crumpled map, jumped out. "You all right?" he called out, concern etched into his weathered features. I nodded, though my mouth felt dry and my legs were shaking. "Yeah, thanks, I don't know what that was." He looked into the woods, his expression hardening. "There's some strange stuff that happens around here. You should be careful." I didn't argue. The AA truck's engine roared back to life, and the driver got to work, hooking up my car. As he worked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every rustle of the leaves, every crack of a twig made me flinch. I wanted nothing more than to get away from that cursed stretch of road. When the car was finally ready, I climbed into the passenger seat of the tow truck, my heart still racing. The driver glanced at me with a knowing look. "You're not the first to have a night like this around here," he said, his voice low and gravelly. As we drove away, the woods receded into the distance, but the lingering feeling of dread stayed with me. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see that figure following us. The road twisted and turned, leading us away from that place, but I knew one thing for sure: some places are best left unexplored, and some figures are better left unseen.